I don't ever really remember not loving Jesus, even before salvation. I just always felt like he was very close to me, and I was saved at the age of 10, but I just don't remember not ever loving him or feeling like he was very close to me. And as I look back now, I realize that he knew with everything I was going to be called to endure that I was going to need him very close to me. I knew that he had a strong calling on my life very young. And, but you know, we have a real enemy of our soul. And that enemy had a plan for my life too. I would endure many devastating and tragic events. It would come out that my husband was living a double life, literally. He had fallen into almost every kind of addiction you could imagine. There would be pornography, there would be gambling, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and he would actually have someone that he was keeping up in another state. The pain of adultery was crippling. And once it all came out and we were trying to mend our family, and he was making half-hearted attempts at getting help, our oldest son would be in a tragic accident. Very short-sighted teenage decision to sneak out.
How much of your dad's life and what was going on in his life played into your decisions at this time in your life?
A lot of it. Anything can be an idol, and I guess in a way I idolized my dad. I loved him. He was very calm. He was a great father, and I wanted to be just like him. And when you grow up and you want to be just like somebody, and then all of a sudden you find out that that person you want to be like is doing all these things that he's taught you not to do, it hurt. I was angry, I was mad, I was frustrated, and because of that, I stopped doing right, because my reason for doing right was wanting to make him proud.
So that night in particular, you get in your mom's Navigator and you sneak out. At that point, you panic and you hit the accelerator.
I saw the blue lights. And when I realized the situation that I was in, all I could think was run.
You're at 100 miles an hour, right?
Yep.
When did you realize there was a hairpin turn?
I didn't. And I got to about right here, and I was like, I'm done. And I just took my hands off the steering wheel.
You just did like
Yeah, I
this.
took my hands off the steering wheel and I just covered up my face, because I knew it was over with. I was unconscious for anywhere from 90 seconds to 2 minutes. I mean, it was a couple of minutes. I was out. All I remember is covering up my face, and then I remember kind of waking up, and I didn't remember sneaking out. I didn't remember running from the police. All I knew was that I was locked in, and I felt this pain in my leg, both of them, and I didn't know what it was. And honestly, I thought I was in bed. It felt like there were just ants that were like in my skin, crawling up my leg, eating. And I just started hollering, and I saw flashlights and stuff slowly started coming back. And then there was this smell. After about 30 seconds of me being awake, there was this terrible smell. And I started looking around, and my vision started coming back, and I could see smoke, and I realized where I was and what was going on. And then you could just kind of hear the crackling, like when you're starting a fire in a fireplace. There's just this crackle, 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 and then there was just this intense heat and this loud bang, and I could just see the fire, it was like crawling up my leg, just like it would a log in a fireplace. And there's a lady, I don't know her from Adam, never met her, never heard of her, she didn't know me, never heard of me. But in her quiet time that night, she felt God leading her to sleep on top of the covers in her clothes, which she thought was really weird. So did her husband, but she did it. And when I hit the tree, the impact, the sound, it was so loud that it woke everybody up in the neighborhood, and people were lined up, watching what was going on. And the cops called time of death. They were calling time of death. And she heard them say, "He's dead." And she hollered out, "No, he's not dead. He'll live and declare the works of the Lord." She didn't know who I was or what was going on. She didn't know. She just knew. About 20 seconds later, I woke up and started hollering for help. And the cops were doing everything they could to pull me out, but the fire was it was intense for a while. And I was kind of trapped. And it was one of those moments where I was like, you know, God, this may be it, but if it's not, and if there's a purpose, if there's anything, you know, you're gonna have to get me out, because they can't and I can't. And I reached up through the sunroof, and I was able to grab hold of one of the cops that was there, and the fire just sort of died down, and they kind of pulled and I kind of pushed, and I was just lifted out. I mean, I was under the engine, and then I just wasn't.
So we're in a counseling room at the ER in the North Mississippi Medical Center, and a staff member comes in to share with us the injuries that Bryant had sustained in the wreck. I remember her telling us that he had a gash in his head and received stitches for that, and that he had a punctured lung, but that they were not sure how severe the burns were yet. And at that moment that she said that, I remember feeling this, like this invisible shield come up in front of me and just go over my head. It was the weirdest feeling, and I could not figure out what that was. But at that moment that I felt that come up in front of me and go over my head, it was like everything she said to me that in my natural mind should have been painful and devastating. It just couldn't touch me. It would be years before I would know what that was. The Lord whispered to my spirit and said, I had you under the shadow of my wings. I knew exactly what he meant. Psalm 91.
Looking, what a lot of young people don't realize, what a lot of adults don't realize, is you're looking at the residue of this wreck. You know, the metal legs that you have. Yeah, we thank God because you're able to now proclaim the truth of God's word. But I look at the tire, I look at your legs, I look at that. You know, sin has its impact on our lives, and some of the residue of sin will remain, even though God forgives us. He separates us as far as the east is from the west. We'll never truly understand the grace and mercy of God.
There's something about it when you go into a situation and you know what you're doing is wrong and you do it anyway, and then you deal with the fallout. Satan comes at you with this feeling of you blaming yourself because you knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway, and so you deserve this. You don't deserve forgiveness. You deserve the torment, the regret, the misery.
His fear of being grounded from basketball season and making the decision to run led to a double amputation that would not only cause him to lose basketball season, it would cause him to give up basketball and football and baseball and the dreams that he had to play football for the University of Alabama.
25-year-old Bryant hated 16-year-old Bryant for a really long time for putting him in this situation. And there was this forgiveness that had to take place with myself. You know, I had to forgive myself and stop beating myself up every day because of having to live with the consequences of the sin I made when I was a kid. And I hadn't dealt with that then. What I realized is that there were so many people praying for me, not just for physical healing, but also that God would mentally keep me calm, that God would be with me, that He would lift my spirits, all these things that they were praying for emotionally. And God answered those prayers, because there's no way a 16-year-old kid who has done nothing but play sports his whole life loses his legs and is just okay with it. When the storm settled and I was alone in my bedroom at my house, and there was nobody telling me it was going to be okay, there was nobody kind of, you know, trying to boost my spirits, I realized how big of a decision I just made and how serious the consequences were. And that was when fear started to creep in. I didn't feel like I could tell anybody that I was starting to have these feelings, because everybody had told me how proud they were of me, that I was handling it the way I was. I felt obligated to just keep it inside. And that was when the face was first put on, and it stayed on for 8-9 years. If I let anybody know that, you know, there's any kind of depression, or there's any kind of anger or frustration or even anxiety, if I let anybody know I'm having those emotions, it's going to cheat God out of the miracle of having done what He already did, and you know, it's it was pride is what it was. I didn't want people to know that I was dealing with issues. When I found out that he had been doing drugs and things along those lines, it was weird. At first, it was kind of like a relief. I was like, okay, well, I felt like I was being given leeway to kind of do some rebellion, because I was like, well, if my dad's kind of messed up, then people will understand if I start to mess up. And then when my mom broke down and I saw the pain in her eyes when she was telling me about his affairs, that was when this self-righteous anger just kind of took over, and I hated him.
We would go on to lose everything monetarily, our home, our vehicles. We would have to change schools, move to a different town. We'll go through a very long, difficult, drawn-out divorce. And at the end of that divorce, just 6 weeks after it was final, my husband would pass away.
And I remember sitting down, he said, your grandparents went into your dad's room this morning to wake him up for work, and he wasn't responsive, and they called an ambulance, and when the ambulance got there, they pronounced him dead. He died. The emotions that I felt at that moment were more intense than when I thought I was dying in the van, when I woke up and they had amputated my legs, when I sat in the wheelchair and watched the TCPS football bus drive off for the first time I realized I wasn't ever playing sports again. All those obstacles, all those moments in time where I thought, man, it can't get worse, it can't get worse, it can't get worse. None of it came close to how I felt then, because I kept thinking, there was time, and there wasn't.
I found myself raising 4 sons by myself, thrust back into the workforce, not meaning to live in fear, but just a lot of unknowns.
I woke up one morning and I didn't think anything about it being Father's Day. And I started scrolling through all my text messages, and every one of them were like group texts about, happy Father's Day, so glad it's Father's Day, so thankful for my dad. And I didn't even make it through all of them. I got mad. Man, I had never thought about suicide or anything, but in that moment, something inside me just snapped, and I was like, screw it. And they came in and they trached me, and I was in a coma for 3 days, I believe it was. Ironically enough, I woke up on the 3rd day. And again, it was another scare. And it was a scare that was enough motivation for me to try to get right, so that I didn't screw up like that again. It wasn't enough for me to be willing to deal with the pain and the root of all of my problems that all started when I was 14, 15 years old.
Although he had the double amputation, the burns were all the way up his thighs, and so he would have to have numerous surgeries, lots of skin graft surgeries, and he would live in horrific pain every day. It would require pain management, and through pain management, it would lead to an addiction. And so he would have his own battles to face with that.
Why do I feel like this? Why is this me? Why am I here again at another program? Why can't I do right? And I was just like, everything that I had been scared to even ask God over the last 7, 8 years, it just all poured out of me. I asked God why everything had ever happened that had ever happened to me, good and bad. Why did it all happen? And I could not figure out for the life of me why I was so miserable. And then it dawned on me that the reason I couldn't forgive myself, the reason I couldn't forgive my dad, the reason I had no hope was because I didn't have God. I'd asked him to save me so many times, but I never completely surrendered anything to him. And because of that, he'd never been my Lord and Savior. He'd just been somebody that I knew a lot about, that I like to pretend I was friends with. Asking God the question, would you still forgive me if I asked you now? Even though I don't feel like I deserve to be forgiven. And I almost talked myself out of it, but then something hit me. It was like God just said, I've already died. So whether you accept my forgiveness or not, I've already paid the price for it.
A lot of times, the consequences and the suffering that we endure comes from our own choices. But sometimes the suffering we endure comes from the consequences of other people's choices. But God still has a plan to use all of it. Bryant would end up going to Transformation Ranch, which is a faith-based drug and alcohol addiction facility that was birthed out of a lot of our pain. See, my pastor was my husband's best friend back before he became a pastor. He was a coach and a teacher, and we were all in church together at that time. And he walked alongside Frank, along with another precious man. And but it was through walking that out with Frank, and then also preaching his funeral, that it birthed inside of David this passion to see people set free from addictions. And we get to see people set free all the time. And so Bryant would go through that facility and our program there, and he would thrive. And he actually stayed on 7 months as a counselor.
And I thought, man, I'm good. But the thing is that I still had to deal with pride. I still had to deal with fear. I still had to deal with feelings of inadequacy, anger. Those are all things that had been such a part of my life. They were more of a habit than the actual drugs that I did to numb them. And so God, being about the process and not the destination, is more so in the trials that it takes to overcome those emotional addictions than he is in the actual end result. But because of my surrender to God, it made me willing to go through the process.
Oh, yeah.
And that's essentially it was some people see salvation as the finish, but no, I started the race.
A huge part of the plan that God had for what we had endured came in the form of a book. It's a Christian fiction book called Hellspeed, A Moment from Eternity, and it's Christian fiction, but it's based on true life events, and the main character of the book is based on my son Bryant. And the book came out, and we were doing book signings and speaking engagements together, just seeing all these incredible things happening. But in a momentary lapse of discouragement, and once again becoming short-sighted and not being able to see God's plan in it, Bryant would make the decision to get high, to escape for a little while. Those voices of condemnation returned, and he had other battles ahead that he just could not see how it was all going to work out. So he decided to get high using a very popular method in our day among middle schoolers and high schoolers. It's called huffing. It's just canned air, and by breathing it in, it cuts off the oxygen to your brain. But it's very dangerous because you don't know when you've inhaled too much, and that's what he did, and it cut off the oxygen to his brain too long. And so he passed away. I'm amazed at what he won't do for his children. When they're called to suffer something, he will do everything in his power to protect us. God's word says in Hebrews that his word is powerful and alive and sharper than any two-edged sword. And I had experienced it. I had experienced it come into life. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him I will trust. He shall cover me with his feathers, and under his wings I will take refuge. He had me hidden in the shadow of his wings. Acts 13:36 says that David was born and that he fulfilled his purpose in his own generation, and then he rested with his fathers and saw corruption. So basically he lived, he fulfilled his purpose in his own generation, and then he died. And that's the pattern for all of our lives. Everything that touches the life of a child of God has to funnel through God's hands first. And so if it touches our life, then it has purpose. It's either going to cut away the things that don't belong there, or it's going to put in us what we need to be equipped for the calling that he has for us. I am choosing joy.